Welcome to the History and Focus channel. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more videos like this one. With tensions between Catholics and Protestants running high in the Netherlands in the late 1800s, this Catholic woman and her Protestant husband were buried in different cemeteries, segregated by religion. Fortunately, this couple found a solution to stay together after death by having their graves placed at the wall that separated their cemeteries. An example of religious traditions during Holy Week, particularly in Spain, where solemn processions are held to reflect on mortality, penance, and repentance. The hooded figures are known as Nazarenos, or penitents, symbolizing mourning and meditation on death and redemption. An elephant in 1920 balancing on two bottles, a demonstration of strength and skill that was part of a circus performance. Beside it, a few people, including a dwarf, watched the scene attentively, indicating that this was a rehearsed trick to entertain audiences in circus shows. The lunatic chair was a device used in psychiatric hospitals and asylums to control patients considered dangerous or agitated during a time when approaches to the treatment of mental illness were rudimentary and often cruel. Le Cabaret de l'Enfer was a hell-themed café in the red light district of Paris, also known as Pigalle, the neighborhood of the Moulin Rouge, created in the late 19th century and operating until the mid-20th century. In 1904, professional rat catchers were a common sight in major European cities, where pest control was a public health issue. These rat catchers scoured sewers, alleys, and other infested areas, exterminating as many rodents as possible. They were paid for each rat they killed, often displaying their kills as proof of their work. During World War II, gas masks for babies were developed as part of civil defense measures to protect the population from chemical weapon attacks. Adult masks were already common, but concern for babies led to the creation of a special design for the most vulnerable. In April 1926, dozens of Ku Klux Klan members in Cannon City, Colorado, marched down Main Street, while some also rode the Ferris wheel. There, they posed for a photo at the carnival owner's insistence, and a story about it appeared on the front page of the local newspaper the next day. A Chinese woman whose feet were bound in the late 1800s. Although foot binding fell out of practice in the 1930s, this painful tradition persisted in China for about 1,000 years. From breaking toes to having excess flesh cut off, countless girls underwent an agonizing process to achieve an ideal 3-inch foot. This curious and unusual 1865 historical photo shows a peddler offering mummies for sale near the pyramids of Egypt. At that time, the trade in Egyptian antiquities and artifacts, including mummies, was common, fueled by the growing demand from European collectors and museums during the height of Egyptomania. The lion used for MGM's title credit was indeed a real specimen named Leo the Lion. Since Leo was a cinema icon, it was only fair that he met the cinema legend, director Alfred Hitchcock. Fortunately, the 1957 Tea Time meeting was captured just in time for us to appreciate it forever. In 1961, Soviet Dr. Leonid Rogozov was stationed at a Russian base in Antarctica when he realized he had acute appendicitis, and he was the only doctor there. Since escaping Antarctica was out of the question due to heavy snowstorms, the doctor was forced to remove his own appendix. Rogozov not only survived but returned to work in just 2 days. Robert McGee was one of the few who survived a brutal scalping at the hands of the Sioux tribe in 1864 when he was just 13 years old. At the time, McGee was an orphan traveling with a wagon train heading west. During the journey, the group was attacked by a band of Sioux warriors led by Chief Little Turtle. McGee was captured and subjected to scalping, a cruel and painful practice in which the scalp is removed. This practice was known as a bee beard competition, where beekeepers and enthusiasts allowed a swarm of bees to settle on their bodies, creating the illusion of a beard made of insects. This kind of feat was common at public exhibitions and competitions in the early 20th century, often with the aim of impressing or entertaining crowds. Believe it or not, there was a time when American children were sent by mail. When the USPS Parcel Post Service officially began on January 1, 1913, it allowed customers to send large packages, including people, as long as they did not weigh more than 11 pounds and were properly stamped. German-American farmer John Meintz shows the harmful effects of the attack he suffered on August 19, 1918, when townspeople dragged him from his home in Luverne, Minnesota, whipped him, and then tarred and feathered him. Meintz was attacked amid anti-German sentiment that took root during World War I. A Chinese driver convicted of speeding poses for a photo after being sentenced to wear the traditional kang, a wooden board weighing up to 30 pounds that was used as punishment for centuries throughout East Asia until 1900 for 24 hours. In the summer of 1933, a man named A.L. Khan was fishing off the coast of New Jersey when he landed a giant manta ray that measured 20 feet in length and weighed 5,000 pounds. The catch was so challenging that it took Khan, his companions, and the U.S. Coast Guard several hours and dozens of gunshots to finally capture what they called the devilfish. In 1925, two adventurers, Gladys Rocks and Ivan Unger, played a tennis match on top of an airplane at 3,000 feet in the air. Although it may seem like a montage, scenes like this were common during the 1920s and 1930s when aerial stunts were performed as part of wing-walking shows. Long before today's idea that people can accept themselves as beautiful no matter what, there were very strict beauty standards that led some individuals to undergo rather bizarre and painful procedures. This is a freckle remover, from a time when freckles were not considered beautiful or attractive. The woman in the chair has a doctor literally freezing the skin on her face with carbon dioxide in an attempt to remove her freckles. In 1937, an unusual scene caught the public's attention at a carnival in the United States, the exhibition of a mummy that was supposedly the body of John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of President Abraham Lincoln. Booth, known for killing Lincoln in 1865, was reported dead shortly after the assassination, but stories and conspiracy theories emerged suggesting that he had escaped capture. This is Radiana, known as a robot built with human bones. This eerie and unusual creation represented an early attempt to combine the emerging technology of the time with biological materials, resulting in a mechanical figure that likely evoked both fascination and repulsion. In the 1920s and 1930s, the quest for maintaining clear skin, associated with beauty and social status at the time, led to the use of these eccentric accessories. In the photo, we see fashion and beauty practices from a period when sun protection did not involve the use of sunscreen, but rather the complete covering of the skin. No one knows exactly why a hospital janitor named Harriet Cole decided to donate her body to science, but her incredible donation of her nervous system lives on to this day. Shortly after Cole's death in 1888, Dr. Rufus B. Weaver got to work on what would be a medical novelty: the removal and subsequent mounting of an entire person's nervous system. The meticulous process took 6 months, but once completed, it became an invaluable teaching tool. The punt gun was so powerful it was banned for being too effective. This comically large weapon was first built in the early 1800s when the demand for duck skyrocketed. Capable of killing 50 to 100 waterfowl with a single shot, it began to decimate duck populations. In Ireland, there is an old tradition where men known as straw boys appear at weddings. These men typically wear hats or masks made of straw that cover their faces and wear simple outfits, usually made of straw. It is believed that the presence of straw boys brings good luck, health, and prosperity to the newlyweds. Coal miners in Belgium ascending in an elevator after a long day of work in the mines, circa 1900. These miners, often covered in soot and visibly exhausted, faced extremely dangerous and exhausting working conditions. Two women sitting side by side in the 19th century. The woman on the right appears to be alive and is dressed in formal attire of the time, while the woman on the left, with an unusual appearance, was reportedly no longer alive. The practice of post-mortem photography was common during this time, serving as a way to preserve the memory of loved ones, especially in an era when photography was a novelty. 19th century anthropologist displaying a pair of shrunken heads from Ecuador. Shrunken heads, also known as tsansas, were created by indigenous tribes such as the Jivaro people, who inhabited the Amazon region of Ecuador and Peru. This process involved complex preservation techniques and was performed as part of spiritual and cultural rituals, often following battles. The Montparnasse station disaster in Paris, which occurred on October 22, 1895, was one of the most iconic train accidents of the time. The train involved, an express from the Granville-Paris line, failed to stop in time upon arrival at the station. The engineer, attempting to make up for a delay, entered the station at high speed. Despite applying the brakes, the braking system failed, and the train crossed the platform, crashed through the station wall, and flew out of the second story. In 1930 in London, a curious and unusual competition drew attention: the ankle contest. In this competition, a policeman was assigned to judge the ankles of female participants. The goal was to select the most beautiful or aesthetically pleasing ankle. In the 1920s, California Alligator Park was a peculiar tourist attraction in the United States where visitors could interact closely with alligators. The park offered the opportunity to feed and even ride on alligators, practices that today would be considered extremely dangerous and unacceptable due to modern animal welfare and public safety standards. Stefan Bobrowski, known as Lionel the Lion-Faced Boy, was a popular figure in circuses and freak shows of the early 20th century. Lionel suffered from a rare condition called hypertrichosis, which causes excessive hair growth all over the body, including the face. This gave him a unique appearance, resembling a lion, which earned him the nickname. Frank Lentini, born on May 18, 1881, the 13th child of a couple who already had 5 boys and 7 girls, was born with a significant abnormality. As seen in the photo, he had 3 legs, 4 feet. The 4th foot was not visible as it was positioned behind the 3rd leg, and 2 functional genital organs. Victorian photography trick. While this photo from around 1901 may seem disturbing, and while traveling freak shows were very common during that time, this photo is actually an example of trick photography. As cameras of the time required a long exposure to capture an image, enthusiasts liked to play with the technology, moving while the photo was being taken to create bizarre images. To this day, the only Wild Man suit is on display at the Menil Collection in Houston, Texas. A set of double-layered armor coated from head to toe with 1-inch long, outward-facing iron spikes, this suit remains as terrifying as it is mysterious. Fannie Mills was born in 1860 and suffered from Milroy's disease. This caused Fannie's feet and legs to swell to an enormous size. When she died at age 39, her feet measured 17 inches in length, equivalent to a U.S. men's shoe size 29. A reporter described Mills' feet as 2 immense hams. These swollen and disfigured hands reveal the chilling effects of gout. They were preserved by Dr. Thomas Dent Mutter, the renowned scientist who would later tragically suffer from the disease. In addition to these hands, the doctor left behind a vast and disturbing collection of anatomical and pathological specimens. Much of this can still be seen today at the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia. 2 men constructing a death mask in New York, circa 1908. Death masks, wax, or plaster molds made around the head of the deceased were used for various purposes, primarily those intended to honor the dead with a statue or some type of display. The first adaptation of the character Ronald McDonald, the iconic McDonald's mascot. This version of Ronald, from the mid-1960s, features a look quite different from what would become his classic outfit. He is wearing a food tray-shaped hat and has a cup attached to his nose, a design that might seem strange or even frightening by today's standards. An early Mickey Mouse Club gathering in a theater in Ocean Park, California. By 1932, the club had 1 million members in the U.S. In this rather disturbing photo, we see a theater full of children, all wearing Mickey Mouse masks. With the entire audience wearing the same mask, the atmosphere of terror stands out to anyone viewing the photo without knowing its context. Members of the Young Pioneers, a Soviet youth group, wear gas masks as part of a preparation exercise for an attack in the Leningrad area in 1937. This type of photography was part of the spiritualist movement of the time, when people believed it was possible to capture images of spirits or ghosts on photographic film. The technique often involved double exposure tricks or manipulations during the development of the photo. After John Dillinger was shot and killed by the FBI in 1934, a Chicago mortuary put the bank robber's body on display to the public. Thousands of spectators lined up to see the fallen criminal, who by this point had become a sort of Robin Hood-like figure. Halloween costumes from decades ago were undeniably much scarier than anything you see today. From disturbing doll masks to bags placed over children's heads, the standards were a bit less strict back then, making the costumes even more unsettling. Humpty Dumpty is a character from a children's nursery rhyme, depicted as an anthropomorphic egg with a face, arms, and legs. His first appearance was marked by his disturbing look, despite being intended for children of the time. Enos the chimpanzee, before being inserted into NASA's Mercury Atlas V space capsule, in which he would become the first primate to orbit Earth on November 29, 1961. A Mongolian woman is imprisoned inside a wooden box as punishment in 1913. The scene was recorded in Mongolia at the beginning of the 20th century and shows a brutal method of punishment where a person was confined inside a box for days, often without food or water as a form of punishment. In 1917, 16-year-old Elsie Wright and her 9-year-old cousin Frances Griffiths took photos with the Cottingley fairies in the village of Cottingley near Bingley, West Yorkshire. One of the biggest frauds of the 20th century, they only admitted that the photos were faked in 1983. The iconic photograph, Dali Atomicus, was the result of a collaboration between renowned surrealist artist Salvador Dali and American photographer Philippe Halsman, published in 1948. In this image, Dali poses in a completely surreal scene where various elements appear suspended in the air, including cats, water, easels, and art objects, creating the illusion of a frozen moment in time. An armored Heimwehr car patrolling the streets of Vienna during a period of political tension in 1934, shortly after the assassination of Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss. The vehicle was part of efforts by conservative authorities to control the situation and prevent further unrest in response to the failed Nazi coup that resulted in Dollfuss's death. This 1887 photograph, taken by Ernest Barrow, appears to depict a scene inspired by the famous work Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. The Dormouse is a character that appears during the Mad Tea Party with the Mad Hatter and the March Hare in one of the book's most iconic and surreal passages. Waiters serve lunch to two ironworkers on a beam high above New York City on November 14, 1930, during the construction of the famous Waldorf Astoria Hotel. George McLaurin was the first African-American student admitted to the University of Oklahoma in 1948, following a legal battle for the right to study at an institution that had previously been whites only. However, even after his admission, McLaurin was forced to sit separately from his white classmates in an isolated section of the classroom, library, and cafeteria. It is said that the sun ages your skin like nothing else, but tanning protective masks, like the ones these three ladies wore in 1950, look absolutely terrifying. In 1932, this photograph captures people at the wheel of a vehicle that looks like something straight out of a science fiction movie, even by today's standards. The futuristic design of the car, with bold lines and unusual curves for the time, surprises with its innovation and daring. A doll factory where dozens of baby heads are placed together. They are dripping paint as they get ready to be connected to their bodies. 4 children pose together outdoors, but something unusual catches the eye upon closer inspection. Between the 2 children in the center, a strange figure appears in the background. This figure looks like a ghostly face or an unusual presence, giving the image a somewhat eerie and mysterious tone. In 1930, a devastating fire struck the famous Madame Tussauds Wax Museum in London, causing widespread destruction. The fire destroyed much of the museum's exhibits, which were known for their incredibly detailed wax replicas and had a significant impact at the time. The remains of the melted mannequins were a grim reminder of the destruction, but also a curious representation of the transformative and unpredictable power of fire. The Carnival of Huejotzingo is a traditional Mexican celebration held annually, blending indigenous elements with Spanish influences, featuring dances, colorful costumes, and theatrical representations of historical events. Horna's work captures the essence of this festivity, showcasing her unique perspective on the cultural expressions and vitality of this community event. In 1959, Salvador Dali, the famous surrealist artist, expanded his creativity beyond painting and sculpture, venturing into jewelry design as well. Dali's jewelry is known for its unusual and bold shapes, often incorporating surrealist elements such as eyes, mouths, and hearts, crafted with precious stones and noble metals. A man wearing the Brewster body shield, the first body armor developed by the U.S. during World War I. This chromium-nickel steel suit could weigh up to 40 pounds and indeed stop some bullets. Although robots seem like a primarily 21st century invention, the concept began long ago. Automatons were mechanical machines made to resemble humans or animals, a popular innovation in France during the 18th century. These automatons, often designed by watchmakers and inventors like Jacques de Vaucanson and Pierre-Jacques Droz, were capable of performing complex movements, such as playing musical instruments, writing, or drawing, giving the impression that they were alive. Part of a freak show in a circus or exhibition. The woman, considerably larger in size, holds a small man, both dressed formally. These images were common in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when people with unusual physical characteristics such as extreme obesity or dwarfism were often displayed in circuses and fairs. In 1929, during an intense heatwave, the wax mannequins used to display clothing in department stores began melting due to the high temperatures. The melting of the mannequins created a disturbing visual effect where faces and bodies seemed to disintegrate, leaving a curious mark in the history of commerce at the time. French neurologist Guillaume Benjamin Armand Duchenne, Wright, conducts an electrophysiology experiment, activating the muscles of a subject with electrical probes to produce a specific facial expression around the mid-19th century. Duchenne was conducting these electrophysiology experiments to study facial expressions and how they are linked to muscle activity. He believed that each human emotion had a corresponding facial expression and that these expressions were controlled by specific muscles. Famous naturalist Charles Darwin said she was a remarkably good woman. She suffered from a genetic disorder called terminal hypertrichosis, which caused her face and body to be covered in straight black hair. Her ears and nose were extraordinarily large, and her teeth were uneven. This restaurant in Los Angeles, opened in 1926, offered a unique and immersive experience where customers could experience life in prison in a fun way. Guests were served in small cells, and waiters dressed as prisoners, recreating the environment of a penitentiary. In the 1930s, baby cages were a practical and surprisingly common solution in urban areas like London and New York. Attached to the exterior of apartment windows, these structures allowed small children, especially babies, to get fresh air and sunlight, which were considered essential for health at the time. The idea behind these cages was to offer outdoor exposure to children whose families lived in apartments without access to gardens or balconies. This photo was taken at Coney Island in New York and shows a woman who was supposedly headless. The people running the attraction claimed that she had lost her head but was kept alive through feeding tubes and various devices. In this historic photograph, we see the colossal head of the Statue of Liberty still under construction, alongside two people dressed in late 19th century clothing. This image was taken in France around 1884, when the statue was being assembled in parts before being shipped to the United States as a gift from the French people. Commander Richard Byrd, wearing a specially made leather helmet and mask, embarked on a historic journey over the North Pole. Alongside his pilot, Floyd Bennett, Byrd flew a Fokker aircraft on an impressive 360-mile trip, which lasted just over 15 hours. Equipped with outfits designed for extreme cold and challenging conditions, the two navigated the skies from Spitsbergen, marking a notable achievement in the history of aerial exploration. On April 17, 1928, a new hour of entertainment was recently introduced to the country's radio audience with the debut of Michelin Hour, presented by the Rubber Tire Manufacturing Company. The orchestra members are dressed in costumes of the company's mascot. May 8, 1941, New York, LaGuardia Field. No, these are not men from Mars, but TWA mechanics and inspectors with propeller spinners on their heads, while performing spring maintenance on the giant transport planes at the airport. Hundreds of young women who worked in clock factories throughout the 1920s were exposed to so much radium that they would return home glowing in the dark. The exposure often caused their vertebrae to collapse, their jaws to fall off, and their lives to end slowly, thanks to agonizing battles with cancer. For years, Big Mary worked for the traveling Sparks world-famous shows circus, where she entertained people from coast to coast. All of this came to an abrupt end in 1916, when the town of Irwin, Tennessee, imprisoned Mary for murdering a trainer who had beaten her with a hook. Later, they hanged her from a crane in front of a crowd of spectators. When South Vietnam collapsed in the final stages of the Vietnam War in 1975, President Ford ordered the mass evacuation of Vietnamese orphans from Saigon. A massive North Vietnamese offensive was approaching, and time was of the essence. In the end, Operation Babylift saved over 3,000 orphans. In 1890, prosthetic technology was still in its early stages, but remarkable advancements were being made. Prosthetics of the late 19th century were generally made of wood, metal, and leather, designed to restore some functionality to those who had lost limbs due to accidents, diseases, or congenital deformities. An Army Sikorsky R-5 helicopter undergoing aerial tests demonstrates its lifting power by carrying 17 people and the pilot into the air, while spectators wave in Bridgeport, Connecticut on January 10, 1946. During the tests, records for altitude and speed with payload were claimed. This 1899 photo from the New York Times recalls a time when Thanksgiving was more like Halloween. With revelers dressed in costumes en masse to celebrate this day of gratitude, the holiday was considered the busiest time of the year for masked traffickers and the like. Serbian scientist Nikola Tesla sits near his magnifying transmitter, an advanced version of the famous Tesla coil that he used for the wireless transmission of electrical energy at his laboratory in Colorado Springs, 1899. A pile of American bison skulls waiting to be turned into fertilizer circa the mid-1870s. Holding seances to connect with those who are on the other side has been a tradition for centuries. Here, a group of people witnesses a musical instrument levitating during a seance with the dead. The ventriloquist dummy is more than just creepy. No one is sure if this is real or just something from a horror movie set, and the uncertainty about whether it is real or part of a cinematic setting only increases the curiosity about its true origin. Much of Boston's North End is in ruins after the Great Molasses Flood on January 15, 1919. A molasses storage tank ruptured, releasing up to 2.3 million gallons into the streets at 35 miles per hour, killing 21 and injuring. Woodrow Wilson, U.S. President during World War I and responsible for promoting the League of Nations, these portraits served as a tribute to his leadership role during times of global conflict. The formation of living portraits involved detailed planning, where soldiers were precisely positioned to create the illusion of a gigantic portrait when viewed from an aerial perspective. In 1922, Zach T. Wilcox, from Carson City, Nevada, was known as the man with the longest beard. He started growing his beard in 1881, and for 41 years he kept up the habit, until he became a true legend for his impressive beard length. His beard became his trademark, and he drew attention wherever he went, being a highly photographed and talked about figure. In 1937, two British men were photographed modeling a curious invention, the periscope hat. This unusual accessory was created to allow people to have a better view from above, especially in crowds or at events with large gatherings. With an ingenious design, the hat was equipped with a small built-in periscope, providing an elevated view without the need to move or seek a higher spot. The Disneyland crew takes a break from their shift and refuels in the theme park cafeteria in 1961. Although this historic photo was probably staged, showing the astronaut struggling to eat while wearing his helmet, it still manages to create a curiously bizarre image. A woman using a curious device that looks like a type of air inhaler or oxygen mask. Although it looks futuristic, this device was created in the 1920s as part of a popular health practice of the time, oxygen therapy. These chapels were built by Capuchin monks in various parts of Europe, including Rome, as a reminder of the transience of life. The use of the bones of their deceased brethren in the decorations had a spiritual purpose, to remind the living that death is inevitable, but the soul is eternal. Trays full of glass eyes in a prosthetic eye workshop. Glass eyes were, and still are, used by people who lost one of their eyes due to accidents, illnesses, or surgeries. Each eye is carefully hand-painted to resemble a real human eye as closely as possible, replicating the color, shine, and even the details of the iris. In a London beauty salon in 1939, permanent wave hairstyles were extremely popular, and this innovative device was created to facilitate the process, which involved wrapping the hair in curlers connected to wires and electrically heated. Photo of a curious invention from 1950, a pistol that fired colored caustic soda. This shock weapon was created as an alternative since citizens could not carry firearms. The caustic soda shot, in addition to causing pain and skin irritation, had a strong color, making it easier to identify the target.